to you.
Okay, well, thank you everybody for turning out on such a cool evening. So thanks for making the effort. And I'm just going to hand straight over to Mike, who is obviously going to remember to unmute his microphone so he can pick up the chit chat. And he's going to talk to us about slowing the flow and the natural flood management scheme up above Pickering. So over to you, Mike, and hopefully we'll have some nice difficult questions for you a little bit later on.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you very much, David. Yeah, there are certain advantages to all this lockdown thing, isn't there? When you can, when it's a lousy evening and you're still sitting nice and snug at home. Right, I better crack on because I can talk for hours on this subject, and every single bullet point I could probably talk for an hour on, and I haven't got that long. So this is the slowing the flow and natural flood management with a few beavers thrown in. I always like to start off by saying I'm not an expert because I don't have any qualifications. And that's only the fact that I've got 14 years of practical experience, so make of that what you will. We are never going to stop all floods. It is just not feasible. But unfortunately, man-made climate change is making them more frequent, more intense, and of course, conversely, you get more droughts that come with it as well, which causes problems of its own. Mother Nature is massively more powerful than we are. So the top priority, as far as I'm concerned, is to stop making climate change worse. But after that, we can only hope to limit the damage from the manageable flood events. There are always going to be unmanageable ones. That is what happens in nature. Now, for about 5 years now, I've been asking these questions, and you don't have to answer, but it's something for you to ponder over and make you think of it. And the first one is based on really what happened in 2015 across the north of England, where there were massive floods. Every town, village, city, hamlet, even individual houses got flooded, an awful lot of them, even on hillsides from surface water. So I ask, can we afford hard flood defences, as in concrete walls, to defend every vulnerable community against flood events? Quite clearly, to me, the answer is no. So if it's unaffordable, do we abandon communities to frequent flooding? Will dredging every river solve our flood problems? Because that's something that gets mooted very often. I'll go into that a bit more later. Do we continue to treat the symptoms where flooding occurs, or should we try and address the causes? Obviously, addressing climate change is the principal one there, but that is a biggie. I'm talking about the causes, what makes the water come to us so quickly. So how about, do we need a fresh approach looking at the whole catchment rather than looking at, oh, it's flooded in Pickering, what do we do in Pickering? So quite a long time ago, when we first called this in Pickering slowing the flow, there's also speeding the flow. And I like to get clear in my mind what is doing which. And this is the bad stuff. So most of these are based on reducing hydraulic roughness. That might sound a bit technical to some of you, but it just means how easily or difficult it is for the water to run over a surface. And the rougher a surface is, the more it attenuates or slows the water. Whereas if you put a very hard, smooth surface, the water will run off quickly. And that is the sort of thing that causes floods, because when water moves quickly, that's when it causes the floods. So dredging from source to sea, which some say, oh yeah, if we dredged everything, there'd be no problem, because it speeds the water very quickly along the channel. The problem with that argument is it actually speeds the flow to the next town or village or bridge or culvert or whatever the constriction is in the channel. And because it's moved there so quickly in bulk, that's when it floods. So unfortunately, dredging doesn't work generally, although it might do in specific cases. For example, through a town where you actually want to get the water through the town more quickly. Deforestation and removing hedges, that is all about removing the hydraulic roughness, so that speeds the flow. Funnily enough, bare ground with Himalayan balsam and crop types, that came up in the previous thing with Ryedale. And if you've got bare ground, particularly through the winter, not only does the water run off more quickly, but it's more likely to take a lot of the soil with it. So you get scouring, then you get the sediment in the river. Funnily enough, that's the stuff that people say, why don't we dredge more? And this is the stuff that's going in. Address the sediment supply rather than saying dredge everything. Soil compaction, which comes mainly through overgrazing and running heavy machinery over it. The more you compact the land, the quicker the water runs off. When we're looking at moorlands, if you've got drainage channels in the moorland up there, you get heavy rain and it's soft peat. It very quickly rips that peat away and scours away and makes those drainage channels bigger and bigger. Hence, the water runs off more quickly. Not only that, but it's usually that horrible brown stuff that the water companies hate. Dodgy ploughing, that one came up as well. If you plough up and down a field, it's absolutely brilliant drainage channels, takes the water and half of your soil with it. And I was under the impression that that was one of the most valuable commodities of the farmer. If you plough across the field, it has the opposite effect. It sort of holds the water because it depends on the gradient, of course. And the obvious one is increasing impermeable surfaces of buildings, roofs, roads, paving, tarmac, concrete, very quick runoff. Now, the other side of the coin is trying to slow the flow. You can still have effective drainage, but if you slow it down through natural flood management, as in working with nature, rather than fighting against it with concrete and saying, oh, we're really tough and clever now. But why not just work with nature? Because nature has its own processes of slowing the flow. And as you'll see in a couple of the pictures there, those are fairly simple woody debris dams. And as you can see, they leak. So under low flow conditions, the water drains out. When you get the heavy rain, they're still emptying, but they fill up behind. So you've effectively got a lot of storage upstream. So instead of that water quickly rushing down to your town or village, hopefully some of it's held up there. And the more of those little dams you put in, and they are little, so they have relatively little effect, but the effect is cumulative. So the more of that stuff that you put in upstream, it all adds together. Not only that, but it's effective for the full length of the river system until it gets down to the sea. Because once you've slowed it at the top, it's slowed all the way down. You look at hardened flood defences, they just protect the immediate vicinity of wherever your flood walls are. So reforestation, hedge planting, reintroducing that hydraulic roughness again, block those moorland drains, restore the peat, because sphagnum moss holds an amazing amount of water. And if you're holding that water up on the moorland, that is much better for periods of drought because that means it's going to stay wet for longer. That is a real key issue, sphagnum moss on the moors with climate change. Attenuation ponds is just a case of if you've got any old dams or you've got a pond or something, make it leak, as in put a culvert or a drain into it so that normally it drains down, but when you get the heavy rainfall, it fills up and empties slowly, and you can have lots of those. SUDS is sustainable drainage systems, and that tends to be in the towns and villages where you can, it's all the same stuff, little berms and swales, you know, even more grass and sedum roofs, so all the rain is held in there and runs out slowly. Catchment sensitive farming, whoops, sorry, going on one. Catchment sensitive farming is all about trying to teach farmers to do the right things in the right way. And that includes the buffer strips that were mentioned in the previous one again. And that is putting that hydraulic roughness into that border between a field and a river. So you're not only holding back the water, you're holding back the nutrients, because they spend a fortune on that sort of stuff. And you don't want it running into the rivers, because not only do we not want it in the river, but it promotes weed growth and so on. Tussocky grass and shrubs, again, it's just anything that is that high hydraulic roughness. If you re-meander and braid rivers where they've been straightened in the past, that slows the flow. It actually makes the length of the river that bit longer and reduces the gradient, and therefore reduces the speed that the water goes down. And if you reduce the speed, you get much less scour, and it's not moving downstream as quickly. Address sediment supply, that's what I've already mentioned, and just stop cleaning rivers generally, because we like to neaten things up. That's really applying upstream. Once you get down into the vales and through the towns, it's a slightly different matter. So the essentials are putting the right measures in the right places, taking a whole catchment approach. So if you look at the upland, manage that in the right way, so you are slowing the flow by all those methods that I said before. Upstream storage, now the picture there is the engineered bund in above Pickering, which quite clearly isn't a natural feature, but it is just another leaky dam, because that's a concrete wall with a culvert in it. There are no sluice gates or anything like that. It's just a hole that's calculated so the river runs through under normal conditions. As the water rises in heavy rainfall, it gets to a point where it's surcharging, which means there's no more water can get through that culvert, and it starts backing up behind the dam. The amount of water running downstream through Pickering is calculated for the amount to just not flood the town badly. So you're getting as much water through as you can while holding what would have been flooding the town back behind that bund. It's actually got 120,000 cubic meters of storage. So if it does overtop, if you get a really mega rainfall, it'll still flood the town, because it's all the water is now coming over the top. But at least you know exactly what time it floods. And for every massive flood that you can't stop, there are dozens that you have stopped. And since it was completed in 2015, it's been in operation 27 times, would you believe? Not in a major way, but some of them are fairly significant. Then we can actually flood the floodplain exactly as the river intended, until we built walls and houses and, you know, all that sort of thing. And of course, actually, we do get flooding of the floodplain quite often, and people complain because we've built houses in the floodplain. It actually is part of the river. The river channel, as we see it normally, is the minor part of the river itself, but the river's floodplain is what the river developed for periods of high flow. So it's not really that good an idea to build on it, but we do, because somebody can make money out of it. River maintenance, of course, the flooding the floodplain is slowing the flow, because again, you're just storing the water rather than having it running straight down. So river maintenance, which involves dredging and the clearing of vegetation, that's speeding the flow. But again, as I said, if you're looking at the area just below the town and the town itself or village, you actually do want to get the water cleared from that. So slow it above, get it quickly through the villages and the towns or the cities, and then try and hold it up again before you get to the next place. It might not be too popular with the farmers, of course, if you're flooding their farmland, but that's what the new environmental, what's it called, ELMS, environmental land management, that's it, system is all about, which is about public money for public goods. So how good that's going to turn out to be, I don't know. And even hard defences, there are times when flood walls are the only thing you can do, but put them in the right places and in conjunction with the other stuff. So who maintains this NFM, Natural Flood Management, and who pays? And it's a very good question, and one which I've been banging on about for at least 10 years now, because is there a national policy for government on that, backed up by money? And the answer is no, because they sort of, you might have heard the expression for DEFRA, who are often called deaf ear. And it's something like that, because what they say is, oh, well, whoever builds this stuff, whoever puts the woody debris dams in or whatever, it's their responsibility to inspect it, maintain it and replace it. And if it's built of timber, it's going to last 20, 25 years. Of course, there are safety aspects you've got to look at. So it needs replacing. But if it's a community group or an NGO or even a government agency like Forestry England, and they're not given the cash or the resources to maintain and replace this stuff, what do? And it is a problem. And believe me, I've banged on about it at length, which brings to the question, well, what about beavers? I should mention that picture there is what's known as the political fence, because that's the compound for keeping the beavers in. It costs a lot of money, but that's because there are certain sensitivities around landowners when you're talking about beavers. Now, one of the first lot was down in Devon, the Devon Wildlife Trust. Somebody released some beavers, I think it was in the River Otter, ironically the name. Whether it was by accident or design, these beavers suddenly appeared. There was talking about getting shut of them, whether it was exterminating them or whatever. And Devon Wildlife Trust managed to convince, I think, DEFRA, just to leave them there, and they would monitor it and manage it, which they did very successfully. They put mechanisms in place so that the landowners and farmers who were really concerned had someone to talk to, and, you know, straight away, and if there's a real problem, we'll deal with it. And this is because beavers in the wrong place, if they start building dams and flooding land that is actually good quality farmland, then the farmers aren't too pleased. And beavers are very efficient at replacing dams that, whether you blow them up with dynamite, rip them out, they'll have them fixed virtually overnight. They're clever little critters. So the first time I saw this dull-looking sort of picture on the left-hand side, I didn't have anybody to explain it to me, and I sort of pored over it for a while, and then suddenly realised, and I thought, it absolutely blew me away, because what you've got, if you look at the 2011, what you've got is a simple single watercourse with a pond, and that was when the beavers were first released or got there. It's a length of 183 metres, so about 200 yards, which is peanuts, really. After a year, you can see in 2012, suddenly there are dams, beaver dams, ponds, and all sorts. 2013, it's even more complex. And literally, 2016, which is the main diagram, it's an absolute network of the rivers, various channels, braided, as in, you know, sort of meanders, whatever, other bits of river, dams and ponds, flooded areas, and absolutely fantastic. Literally in 5 years, just a couple of beavers have done all that. Now, I'll move on to the next one, because this is what they achieved. So 183 metres of watercourse, covering 1.8 hectares. Actually, that means nothing to me. I can't visualise that. But the beavers constructed 13 dams holding up to 1,000 cubic metres of additional water within all these ponds on the site that either they've created or the single pond that was there. But the key thing was that during storm events, on average, the peak flows were 30% lower leaving the site than entering. So in just about 200 yards, the beavers had managed to lower that peak flow by 30%. Now imagine that on a bigger scale, and imagine that if you're living in the town that floods downstream from them. And in addition to that, the lag time between the peak flow entering that site and leaving that site, 200 yards difference, was on average an hour. So that is slowing the flow, attenuating the water. And if you think of, if I should have a picture of a hydrograph. Now that might sound technical, hydrograph, graph, water, graph of the water, that's all it is. And when you get heavy rain, you get a big peak and then it drops off again as the rain stops. And it's the peak of the hydrograph, the bulk of that water that caused the problems with flooding, as in time, that hydrograph, that peak, moves down the system. So instead of having a very sharp peak, if you can slow the flow, you expand the time scale at the bottom because you've slowed everything. And although you've got the same area of water under the graph, you've brought it all down to a lower hump instead of a steep spike. And if you can bring that hump down below that threshold where it floods, Bob's your uncle. You can't do it in really big events, but you can in smaller events. And that's a lovely picture, because beavers are mainly nocturnal, but that's a lovely picture from Cropton Forest of the beavers felling a tree. They're wonderful at gnawing away at these trees, substantial trees. And as far as I know, they never drop them on themselves, but they aren't around to tell you if they do. So the beavers in Cropton Forest, there were 2 of them released only April last year. There were 2 kits by May, so they were quick on the uptake there, the kits being the babies. There are 2 more this year, and they actually do work in family groups. So I haven't really got time to go into too much detail, but they've felled and coppiced many of the waterside trees, and that opens it up to the light, greatly improves the biodiversity. All sorts of plants start to grow that couldn't before. They've repaired the 2 existing ponds where they were released because they were in a very poor condition, and raised the water levels by 1 metre in each. And they've built a 6-foot-high dam across the floodplain, along with the lodge that they live in. And you can see a picture of the dam there. And it's about 6 foot high, that thing. Absolutely amazing, and holds so much water. And again, there's all that attenuation. It improves the water quality because effectively it's all being filtered. It improves the aquatic life, sort of frogs, toads, all that sort of thing, fish. That brings in extra wildlife like herons and so on. And the whole sort of ecosystem is improved. And one interesting thing that I only learned today was the picture that the top left one, that shows a picture of that's willow that's effectively been pollarded by the beavers, because that's what they eat. They eat the sort of under the bark, and they like willow, and they'll eat virtually any of the saplings. And they'll sort of cut that down or chew it down and store it away for the winter, because they sort of hibernate through the winter. But they need a store of food. But something really interesting was pleachers. And if you've ever seen somebody laying a hedge where you cut only sort of 3/4, 7/8 of the way through a stem, and then bend it over so it's still alive and keeps growing up. And you can see the pleaching there, where the clever little critters, that's what they do, the pleaching. So that's taking the willow down, that'll all start sprouting up, which has got such an easy access for them to a food supply for the winter of nice fresh shoots of it. And they're really quite clever critters. So that sort of covers a real whistle stop about the beavers and natural flood management and all the rest of it. And people often say, well, what do we do? Can we do it? How do you do it? And there are 5 things there, and it's not exclusive to natural flood management. Really, it covers virtually any aspect in life. But first of all, get a sound knowledge, know what you're talking about, know your subject, and then not just communication, but effective communication. You've got to talk to people, try and teach them about how it works, why it works, build relationships and trust. And I mean, there's some of you will probably smile at that sort of thing, because that's the sort of thing that you do in all sorts of walks of life. But, you know, build relationships with people so that you do trust them, so that you can work with them effectively. Work with people who have a can-do attitude, because the ones who say, oh, I can't do that, they'll always find a good excuse. The ones who are busy as hell with a can-do attitude, oh, yeah, go on, I haven't got time, but we'll do that. But focus on delivery. Just do it. Don't talk about it incessantly. Mentioning no environment agencies in particular. When you think about the number of consultations and plans and, you know, all this sort of thing, just get on and do something, which is why I always say the Forestry Commission, as they were then, were absolutely brilliant through all of this. And I think that just about does my thing. Oh, look at that, half an hour, spot on. So that's that. So we'll go on to questions.
Yeah, well, I've got 1 or 2 coming in, Mike. I think one that always interests me about it is, how do you go about that bit where you're speeding the water through the towns, and then, you know, you've got to slow it down again once it gets through the town. So how's that working? I mean, it's probably, I can understand if you're going from an upland area to a lowland area, but if you've got, say, a couple of towns in an upland area.
Yeah, well, in a way, it's just the natural process of the river, because you start off in the uplands, and effectively what you do, the river is trying to flatten down every hill and wash it down into the valley, and that's what it's doing over time. So the gradients in the uplands tend to be much steeper. So you've got sort of moorland streams or mountain streams coming very steeply, rushing down. And then as they get down towards the valley, they're slowing down. And that's when you start getting meanders. Of course, in our wisdom, we started straightening rivers for whatever reason, because they were in inconvenient places. And if you look at the distance that a meandering river covers as it wiggles down, and then you turn it from that wiggle into one single straight line, you've actually, you could have even halved the distance, and yet that's over the same distance from A to B. So you've actually doubled the gradient, and that is speeding the river. So if you allow the river to do what it would naturally, as in meander and move more slowly, and then you allow it to go into its own floodplain, because another thing is, one big problem with Pickering Beck, because it's been variously straightened by forestry operations and the railway, as you straighten it, because it runs faster, because it's steeper, it scours more, so it gets a deeper channel. So when you get a lot of rain coming down, it tends to stay in the channel instead of spreading out into its floodplain. Then it whizzes down quicker, and as soon as it gets to places where there are bridges and constrictions, then it floods out. So what you want to do is try and fill a bit of that deeply incised channel, put some big rocks in it and force the water out to the floodplain, and that's slowing the flow. But in the same sense, once you get beyond the town, you tend to be onto a floodplain. But if you allow the water to get back out onto its floodplain, we constrain it in flood banks because we're protecting the farmland, which in a way is sensible. But there are lots of really marginal pieces and poor pieces of land that would be far better employed if we set the flood banks back a bit, or perhaps put another flood bank further back and allowed the flood water to go over the top. Yeah, there are actually ways and means.
Okay. And getting one or two other questions, I'll go on to the beaver ones shortly. Caroline sort of got a question around the theme of landowners and farming practices. What do you think we need to change in that regard? You know, in sort of 2 minutes, really, because I dare say there's quite a lot.
Well, as far as I'm concerned, the absolutely key issue is that we need to pay farmers to flood the land. Now, what we need to be doing, this is my view, of course, we've got to identify which is the best farmland. And clearly we want to keep that as farmland. We don't want that flooding, and that's got to be effectively drained. So hence you have the internal drainage boards. And as far as I can see, the IDBs are the ideal people to recognise which are the prime bits of farmland and which are the marginals and which are the poor. So map it out and say which are the bits of land that we could very easily flood in high flow conditions. But conversely, or as well as that, we've got to look and to the farmers and say, all right, we'll protect your best land, but if we flood this piece of land that's yours, we'll pay you, we'll compensate you for that flooding, whether it's done on a here and now basis every time you flood, or whether it's a sort of annual thing, you know, that's it. And there are people who know, the landowners know which are the marginal pieces of land. So why aren't we mapping it out? And as I said, compensating the farmers for the damage it does. And then at least it's public goods for the public money.
Okay, Caroline, does that answer your question, or do you want to come back with a supplementary?
No, that's fine. Thank you.
Okay, good. Thanks. Okay, got a question from Eden. Maybe Eden would like to give the question yourself, Eden?
Troublemakers here.
Do you know, why did I expect that response? But there it is, Mike. Thanks ever so much. First of all, I think you're being a bit self-effacing here, Mike. I'm sure that most people here know, but it wouldn't really have happened without Mike. So thank you very much indeed. It's a superb scheme, and I think we're all very... Can we be proud of it? If you did it, I think we can really, can't we? But there's been a spin-off. We've perhaps touched on this before, but unfortunately, slowing the flow has been so effective that the Environment Agency have now agreed, or seem to have agreed, that we can all build upstream. And Newbridge, I don't know about other slowing the flow schemes, but Newbridge has been massively developed since slowing the flow came about, with, I suspect, schemes that wouldn't have happened before. What the hell do we do about that?
I'm a bit lost on that one. I usually have an answer, but funnily enough, I was only talking to somebody who rang me out of the blue last week, lives in Shrewsbury, farmer, landowner, and he said that he manages the land really sensitively. He's in the uplands of the River Severn, but apparently there's a big scheme down there in conjunction with one of the major civil engineers to create some wetlands in the uplands of the River Severn, and that's the big River Severn that goes down through Wales. But the key to that is that this is now allowing more development on the floodplain downstream. And I just think, oh God, you know, what this is not what it was all about. And the real danger of that is that most flood schemes are built to a standard. So you'll have heard the sort of terms like a 1 in 100 year flood scheme. And that is generally the one that the Environment Agency will do. So if you build an upstream bund that's a 1 in 100 protection, and then start building on the floodplain downstream of it, that protection, if you get a flood over a 1 in 100, it'll fill all that capacity, as in behind the engineered bund at Pickering. And at that point, it starts to overflow. So everything coming down the valley then goes over the top and floods in exactly the same way that it would have done previously. But as I said, the thing about that is you get notice of when it's going to flood virtually to the minute, so that you can sort of move all your stuff out. Now, if there are people moving into brand new houses and think, oh, well, I'm safe because there's an upstream flood scheme, and yet they're still within the footprint of anything over a 1 in 100 year flood, then it's almost guaranteed that they will flood once that upstream stuff overtops. And how they get around that, I don't know. I think they're just sort of building more on the periphery of the floodplain, but I can't really guarantee what it's all about. And there was a similar thing down at Pocklington as well. So yeah, that's a worry to me, but that's the Environment Agency. And certainly in the case of the big railway shed at Newbridge, allegedly they made provision for the fact,
like that.
I think, made provision for the fact that whatever they built up or whatever they took away, they had to put back, so it had the same capacity. But you're still building on floodplains, and I'm a bit of a loss. That's officialdom for you.
Okay, Mike, Angela's got a question. Do you want to ask your own question, Angela?
Yes, I can do. One of the complaints that I hear quite frequently is, oh, you know, the beck in Pickering that goes through the town isn't cleaned, it isn't maintained by the Environment Agency, and that contributes to flooding. How do you answer that?
A lot of that is a matter of perception. And although if you've got a massive river, I'm thinking of something like the River Ouse, so you've got a huge bulk of water and you've got a load of vegetation at the side and you've got a lot of sediment in it, it doesn't matter quite as much because the water is such a massive proportion of the river compared to the sediment and the vegetation. It's not going to make much difference. But the smaller the river or the water course, the more that vegetation and sedimentation makes a difference, because it's reducing what is effectively quite a low capacity. Now, in the case of Pickering, when you look over the town bridge and see that sediment, a lot of people will look over and say, oh, that's an absolute disgrace, why do they allow it? But in reality, if you poke down through that mud, it's probably only an inch or so deep. So it's a very small proportion of the capacity of the river. And the other thing is, as soon as you get a high flow, if you try and dredge that out, it's very difficult without sort of undermining what is the natural bed of the river. And it's very costly. You wouldn't get too much out. And then the first time there's a sort of high flow, what comes down the river but a muddy soup, and it all settles down into exactly the same places. And when you look at the central pillar outside of your window at the Memorial Hall, that is where it settles, because suddenly you've got fast movement either side and slow movement in the middle, and that's where it drops in. They really have to keep control of the weed, because that weed, and it's back-breaking job trying to get it out, that effectively sieves the sediment, drops it down, and that does fill up the river. You've got to get rid of the worst of the big trees that fall in there, because they'll create blockages. If it's above the town, it doesn't matter, because that's actually slowing the flow upstream. If it's just below the town or through the town, then yes, you definitely got to cut those back. And the Environment Agency do cut most of the trees back on a fairly regular basis, and the smaller vegetation isn't quite such a problem. So in reality, if you poke around at the bottom of the beck, there is very little in there. It's just that it looks a bit messy, and an awful lot of people just want it clean because they like everything to be clean and tidy.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you. That's really interesting.
Right.
Good. Well, I'm going to amalgamate a couple of other questions, basically about beavers. Are there plans to introduce more, or are we allowing nature to take its course. And do you see, is there anything around, should we be limiting how many beavers we have? Because at some point, maybe there could be an overpopulation of them.
It's a really interesting point. Well, the 2 became 4, and this year became 6, and they do work in family units until the family outgrow the area, their patch. And beavers are very, very territorial, and it's not surprising, because if you look at the amount of work they do, and they really do work hard, building these dams and creating the perfect environment. So once the sort of the family unit outgrows that, then they'll want to migrate. And this is the key problem, because if they suddenly migrate downstream into an area that brings them into conflict with man, as in a farmer or a village or something, and suddenly you've got a beaver creating this fantastic dam that's flooding properties and fields, then that's the real problem. And it is a really serious problem in America, where beavers, are everywhere. And they're very clever. They, if people go out and try and kill them, shoot them, trap them, whatever. But the problem is, you've really got to trap the whole family group to move them out to a better location. So they need managing properly, however you do it, whether it is extermination, but preferably trapping them and saying, well, we'll move them to a better location. One thing about the beavers is they are a riparian animal. They live in the river corridors. So they're not, when they're up in Cropton Forest, they're not going to say, well, we've outgrown this lot, notwithstanding that they're stuck in a very serious fenced area. But if they were loose, they wouldn't just head up over the hills. They would go upstream or downstream or up a tributary until they found somewhere that they liked for a new patch. So what I think the Forestry Commission want to do is, at some stage, if they're allowed to sort of run more freely, is to literally barricade or fence across the valley so they can't go downstream. So that way, hopefully, they will pretty much populate the whole of the upper moorland area, Cropton Forest, Keldy Forest, and open up those riparian corridors to much better, more effective ecosystems, provide the flood defences that they are doing, or the flood storage, and maintain all those debris dams and that sort of water storage area, but virtually at no cost. But unfortunately, like most people I know, beavers don't do as they're told. If you say, well, don't go down there, go up there. And, but that's the thing. And they are likely to procreate. Well, they are going to procreate. And it's really a case of, I actually wrote a little bit of a piece which I'll put on the Slow in the Flow Facebook page. But the key thing I see, well, the big problem I see is that it'll be the human failing, not the beavers. It'll be the management of them, because as long as it's volunteers and wildlife groups and maybe NGOs and so on, they'll do the job properly. As soon as you hand it over to officialdom, they'll spend 3 years writing the report on it, say they can't get the funding, by which time everything's out of control. So there we go. But yeah, I can see we're going in the right direction, but it needs managing. And yeah, I can see the human element being the failure.
Great. Okay, well, that's a good answer. We'll have to watch and see what happens with the beaver population above Pickering. Thank you very much for that, Mike. I don't know if anybody's got any last minute questions, or whether that's, I think you've answered everybody's questions, Mike. Thank you very much for an interesting presentation.
Thanks to Richard Burden for one of the photographs. I can see his picture up there. One of his fabulous photographs, and they're always fabulous.
Yeah, well, we've still got a few events left this week, so if you haven't got your tickets for them yet, you know where to go. We've got four more events to come, 2 tomorrow night and 2 on Friday. So don't hold back. And I think that's it. Just thank you for coming along. We're selling apple juice at £2 a bottle. I don't know whether we're full on volunteers for Thursday, but we're having another apple juicing session. I don't know if Peter Winter needs any more volunteers or not. You're on mute there, Peter.
Yeah, we're okay for tomorrow.
Okay.
However, I have to say, judging by the amount of apples we're getting, it wouldn't surprise me if we had another session in the next couple of weeks. So watch this space.
Okay. Thank you very much. Okay. Well, with that, I'll say good night. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you for the talk, Mike. And hopefully see some of you or all of you tomorrow or Friday. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.